The Ia Drang Valley Battle in November 1965 marked what American military commanders saw as a decisive moment in the war. The encounter between the 1st Cavalry Division and North Vietnamese Army regulars demonstrated the potential of American helicopter mobility and firepower. The 7th Cavalry Regiment, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore, engaged in some of the war's most intense fighting at Landing Zone X-Ray, where American forces proved they could meet and defeat North Vietnamese regulars in open combat. The battle resulted in a kill ratio of 12-1 against North Vietnamese forces, with 634 enemy soldiers confirmed killed compared to 79 American deaths. This impressive statistical victory seemed to validate American military superiority and technological advantage. The success of airmobile tactics and overwhelming firepower led General William Westmoreland to implement a strategy that would define the entire war effort: search and destroy. The development of the search and destroy doctrine represented a significant departure from traditional counterinsurgency tactics. Previously, the focus had been on small unit pacification efforts and defending population centers. Now American forces would actively seek out major enemy formations and destroy them with superior firepower. The strategy relied heavily on the mobility provided by the UH-1 Huey helicopter, which could rapidly deploy infantry units into combat zones and provide close air support through helicopter gunships. The concept represented a dramatic departure from traditional military doctrine and counterinsurgency theory. Instead of securing and holding territory or focusing on winning the hearts and minds of the population, American forces would actively seek out enemy concentrations in South Vietnam and eliminate them in such numbers that they could no longer sustain their fighting capability. This approach relied on 3 key elements: intelligence gathering to locate enemy forces, rapid deployment of combat units via helicopter, and the application of overwhelming firepower through coordinated air and artillery support. A typical search and destroy operation began with intelligence reports identifying likely enemy concentrations. Reconnaissance planes and helicopters would survey the area, while radio direction finding equipment tracked enemy communications. Once a target was identified, multiple infantry companies would be deployed via helicopter to establish blocking positions and begin sweeping the area. When contact was made, commanders would call in artillery support, airstrikes, and gunship attacks to maximize enemy casualties. For the first time in modern American military history, success would be measured not by maps and territorial gains, but by body count, a metric that would prove both controversial and problematic. Field commanders were required to submit daily reports detailing enemy casualties, weapons captured, and bunkers destroyed. This emphasis on statistical measures of success created pressure throughout the chain of command to produce positive results, sometimes leading to inflated numbers and questionable engagement practices. The implementation of search and destroy operations required an unprecedented level of logistical support. By late 1967, the U.S. military had established a massive infrastructure throughout South Vietnam, including major air bases, deep-water ports, and an intricate network of supply bases. Hundreds of helicopters were in constant operation, supported by forward arming and refueling points, FARPs, that enabled extended operations in remote areas. The standard equipment for an American infantry soldier reflected this firepower-intensive approach. Each man carried an M16 rifle with 20-round magazines, fragmentation grenades, smoke grenades, and as much ammunition as they could manage, often exceeding 60 pounds of gear in total. Machine gunners carried the M60, capable of delivering sustained automatic fire, while specialized troops carried M79 grenade launchers for additional firepower. This new approach required an unprecedented level of mobility and firepower. Helicopters became the workhorses of the war, ferrying troops into combat zones and providing crucial air support. The strategy demanded a constant flow of fresh troops and resources, leading to a massive buildup of American forces throughout 1966 and 1967. As U.S. and South Vietnamese forces pushed through the countryside, they encountered an enemy that had spent years preparing for this conflict. The Viet Cong had transformed the landscape into a deadly maze, planting thousands of mines and booby traps throughout their areas of operation. These devices ranged from simple punji stakes, sharpened bamboo spikes often smeared with excrement to cause infection, to sophisticated explosive devices made from unexploded American ordnance. The enemy's tunnel systems represented a level of military engineering that surprised American forces. These weren't simple hiding holes, but rather sophisticated complexes that could stretch for miles. The Q-Chi tunnel system near Saigon, for example, contained multiple levels reaching depths of 20 to 30 feet, featuring command centers, hospitals, storage facilities, and even crude air filtration systems. Some tunnels were booby-trapped with explosive charges, punji stakes, and scorpions. Others contained underwater sections that could be sealed to prevent flooding during monsoons. Special tunnel rat teams were formed to explore these underground complexes. These volunteers, typically smaller-statured soldiers, would enter the tunnels armed only with a pistol, flashlight, and knife. The psychological stress on these men was intense. They faced the constant threat of booby traps, hidden defenders, and the possibility of being trapped underground if the tunnel collapsed. These tunnels allowed enemy forces to move troops and supplies undetected, launch surprise attacks, and seemingly vanish into thin air. American soldiers found themselves fighting an enemy they rarely saw, in an environment that seemed designed to kill them. Staff Sergeant Charles Brown captures this frustration. "It's not like my dad's war. We aren't fighting uniformed Nazis on our way to Berlin. Out here, we got to figure things out every day as it happens." The war's impact on young Americans was profound. In San Bernardino, California, 19-year-old Barry Romo exemplified the idealism that drove many to volunteer. Despite his father's warnings about the nature of the conflict, Romo believed in the cause. His father's prescient words would haunt him. "Your brother and I went to war to fight people who were putting other human beings in ovens. All you're going to do is go fight some poor farmer that doesn't want to be bothered with you." After 12 months of training, Romo arrived in Vietnam as a second lieutenant, taking command of a platoon whose previous leader had been critically wounded by a landmine. His experiences would challenge everything he believed about the war and its purpose. The Vietnamese environment proved to be an adversary as formidable as the Viet Cong, presenting challenges that no amount of military training could fully prepare soldiers to face. The climate itself was a constant enemy, with daytime temperatures regularly exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit and humidity levels maintaining a near constant 100%, creating conditions that one military medical report described as a perpetual steam bath with no relief. The impact of these conditions on military operations was severe. Soldiers typically carried between 60 to 80 pounds of equipment, including weapons, ammunition, food, and water. In the intense heat, a man could lose up to 3 quarts of water per hour through perspiration. Despite drinking water constantly, dehydration was a persistent threat. Medical records from 1967 show that heat-related injuries often exceeded combat casualties during major operations. The terrain itself posed multiple challenges. 8-foot-tall elephant grass with edges sharp enough to slice through clothing and skin covered much of the countryside. Dense bamboo thickets created natural barriers that had to be circumvented or cleared with machetes. The jungle canopy could reach heights of 100 feet or more, creating a perpetual twilight below that limited visibility and complicated navigation. During the monsoon seasons, which lasted roughly from May to September in the south and September to January in the north, rainfall could exceed 12 inches in a single day. These deluges transformed jungle paths into treacherous muddy quagmires that could swallow vehicles and make foot movement exhausting. The constant wetness led to immersion foot, a condition similar to trench foot from World War I, affecting thousands of soldiers. The wildlife presented its own deadly array of threats. The jungle housed over 40 species of venomous snakes, including the 2-step snake, so named because victims reportedly could only take 2 steps before succumbing to its neurotoxic venom. The krait, another highly venomous snake, was known to seek warm bodies at night, leading to soldiers occasionally waking to find these deadly creatures in their sleeping bags. The insect population was equally hazardous. Mosquitoes carried malaria, despite the preventive medications troops were required to take. Centipedes reaching lengths of 12 inches could deliver extremely painful bites. Fire ants would swarm any soldier unfortunate enough to disturb their nests during patrol. Even the leeches posed a serious threat, as their bites could lead to infection in the constantly wet conditions. Disease became a major concern. Despite modern medical support, troops suffered from malaria, dengue fever, and various fungal infections. The military's own medical statistics showed that disease and non-battle injuries accounted for 70% of all hospital admissions. Jungle rot, a fungal infection that could literally cause a soldier's boots to rot off his feet, became so common that it was considered almost inevitable during long operations. The monsoon seasons brought their own challenges. Heavy rains turned jungle paths into muddy quagmires, making movement exhausting and resupply difficult. During the dry season, the dust kicked up by helicopters could reveal troop positions to the enemy. Every aspect of the environment seemed designed to wear down both men and equipment. Late October 1967 marked a turning point in the war's intensity. U.S. intelligence detected approximately 6,000 North Vietnamese soldiers massing near the American base at Dak To in Kon Tum province. This remote area in the Central Highlands, close to where Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos met at their borders, had strategic significance as part of the Ho Chi Minh Trail network. The American response demonstrated the full might of U.S. military power. The operation involved elements of the 4th Infantry Division, the 173rd Airborne Brigade, and the 1st Brigade of the 1st Cavalry Division. These American units were supported by the 42nd ARVN Regiment and various South Vietnamese irregular forces, totaling over 6,500 troops. The air support was equally massive. Throughout the operation, fighter bombers from the U.S. Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps flew hundreds of sorties. AC-47 Spooky gunships provided night illumination and close air support. Most significantly, B-52 strategic bombers conducted numerous arc-light strikes, each capable of delivering up to 90,000 pounds of high explosives in a single mission. The battle evolved through several phases. Initial contact occurred in early November when American reconnaissance units detected significant enemy movement. The NVA forces had established elaborate defensive positions throughout the hills surrounding Dak To, including extensive bunker complexes and interconnected fighting positions. These fortifications were expertly camouflaged and mutually supporting, allowing the NVA to deliver devastating crossfire on attacking American units. The fighting culminated at Hill 875, where approximately 2,000 NVA troops had created what amounted to a fortress. The hill's defenses included multiple rings of bunkers, some reinforced with steel and concrete. Underground passages connected key positions, allowing the defenders to shift forces rapidly to meet American attacks. Anti-aircraft positions were carefully sited to threaten supporting helicopters and low-flying aircraft. The American assault on Hill 875 began on November 19th. Elements of the 173rd Airborne Brigade, including the 2nd and 4th Battalions of the 503rd Infantry Regiment, spearheaded the attack. The initial advance met fierce resistance. NVA forces waited until American units were well within their interlocking fields of fire before opening up with devastating effect. Artillery and mortar fire rained down on American positions, while snipers targeted officers and radio operators. The battle reached its tragic climax on November 20th, when a misdirected American airstrike hit the 2503 command post, causing numerous casualties among American forces. Despite this devastating setback, the paratroopers regrouped and continued their assault. Over the next 3 days, they fought their way up the hill in a series of brutal close-quarters engagements. The fighting was often hand-to-hand, with soldiers clearing bunkers using grenades, flamethrowers, and bayonets. The human cost was staggering. The 173rd Airborne Brigade suffered 115 killed, 253 wounded, and lost nearly 1/5 of its fighting strength. Sergeant Charles Brown, who participated in the final assault, witnessed the toll firsthand. "We lost good men taking that hill. The NVA had turned it into a death trap, but our boys fought like lions. These were kids, really, 18, 19 years old, showing the kind of courage you read about in history books." Despite the eventual American victory, the battle highlighted persistent problems with the search and destroy strategy. Of the estimated 6,000 NVA troops initially detected in the area, Only about 1,400 were confirmed killed. The majority of the enemy force executed a well-planned withdrawal into Laos and Cambodia, where American ground forces were prohibited from pursuing them. This pattern would repeat throughout the war. The enemy could choose when to fight and when to withdraw, often preserving the bulk of their forces for future operations. The relationship between American forces and Vietnamese civilians represented one of the war's most complex challenges. By 1967, the United States had committed over $500 million to civilian aid programs in South Vietnam. This massive investment funded the construction of hundreds of schools, medical facilities, and infrastructure projects throughout the country. The U.S. Agency for International Development coordinated many of these efforts, working alongside military civil affairs units. Their programs reached into virtually every aspect of Vietnamese society. New schools brought education to over 1.5 million children. Modern medical facilities provided care to hundreds of thousands who had never seen a doctor. Agricultural programs introduced new farming techniques and improved seed varieties to boost crop yields. However, these ambitious development efforts faced constant challenges from the reality of guerrilla warfare. Villages that accepted American aid often became targets for Viet Cong reprisals. A school built during the day might be burned down at night. Medical personnel who worked with Americans faced assassination threats. The Viet Cong specifically targeted these programs, understanding that their success could undermine support for the communist cause. The military's civic action programs faced their own contradictions. The same unit that provided medical care or built a school one day might be forced to call in artillery strikes on the village the next week due to enemy activity. This dynamic created deep distrust on both sides. American soldiers grew frustrated with villagers who wouldn't warn them about ambushes or booby traps. Vietnamese civilians, caught between opposing forces, often chose neutrality as their safest option. The emphasis on body count as a measure of success created a disturbing dynamic within the American military. Units meticulously tracked enemy casualties, but these numbers often failed to reflect the war's true nature. The taking of Hill 875 exemplified this disconnect. After days of intense fighting and significant casualties, the position was abandoned within a week. In the strategy of search and destroy, territory held less value than enemy body count. This approach took a psychological toll on American troops. They found themselves fighting and dying for objectives that would be quickly abandoned, only to watch enemy forces reoccupy the same ground days or weeks later. As 1967 drew to a close, American military leaders maintained a public facade of confidence. General William Westmoreland assured the public, "We are making progress. We are winning." Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara echoed this optimism. Military progress in the past 12 months has exceeded our expectations. Yet beneath this optimistic surface, ominous signs were building. The North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong were gathering strength, methodically preparing for an offensive that would shake American confidence to its core. Despite the massive American military presence and technological superiority, the enemy was positioning forces for what would become one of the war's most dramatic turning points. Intelligence reports noted unusual enemy movements throughout South Vietnam, but few could imagine the scale of what was to come. As American forces continued their search and destroy missions, the enemy was systematically moving troops and supplies into position for an unprecedented coordinated assault. The winter monsoon season provided the perfect cover for these preparations. In cities and villages across South Vietnam, weapons were being quietly stockpiled. Under the cover of darkness, enemy units were infiltrating urban areas. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army were preparing to demonstrate that despite years of American tactical successes and optimistic progress reports, they retained the capability to strike anywhere, at any time. The stage was being set for an offensive that would challenge every assumption about the war's progress and forever change how Americans viewed the conflict in Vietnam. As 1967 drew to a close, few suspected that the upcoming Lunar New Year, Tet, would mark the beginning of a new phase in the war, one that would test American resolve like never before.